The spring garden party at the Marquess of Westfield's estate unfolded like a painting come to life beneath the perfect May sky, with London's elite society members drifting between manicured hedges and blooming rose bushes, crystal champagne flutes catching sunlight as servants weaved through clusters of silk gowns and formal morning coats. Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood near a marble fountain, her 26 years of life having bestowed upon her both a quiet intelligence and an independent spirit that set her apart from many of the giggling debutantes surrounding her. Though from a respectable family, the modest Blackwood fortune meant Eleanor had never quite belonged among the wealthiest circles, making her friendship with Lady Catherine Spencer, daughter of the influential Earl of Harrington, something of an anomaly in status-conscious London. The sudden hush that fell over the gathering drew Eleanor's attention to the centre of the garden, where Alexander Vane, the Duke of Thornfield, stood tall and commanding in his immaculate attire, his 30 years having only enhanced his striking features and the brooding intensity that had always characterized him since childhood, when their families' estates had neighboured one another in Kent. Lady Catherine, resplendent in pale pink silk that complemented her fair beauty perfectly, gazed up at Alexander with undisguised adoration as his deep voice carried across the suddenly silent garden. "Lady Catherine, would you do me the honour of becoming my Duchess?" The words struck Eleanor with physical force, a sharp pain blooming in her chest that she immediately attempted to dismiss as mere surprise rather than the jealousy that threatened to overwhelm her sensibilities. As Catherine's delighted acceptance rang out and applause erupted around them, Alexander's dark eyes briefly met Eleanor's across the crowd, his expression completely unreadable, despite their years of acquaintance, before he turned his attention back to his new fiancée. Eleanor forced her features into a smile that did not reach her eyes, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles whitened beneath her gloves. As she confronted the uncomfortable truth that had evaded her careful self-discipline for years, despite their different stations and his apparent indifference, she had harbored deep feelings for Alexander Vane that she could no longer deny, feelings that now threatened to destroy both her composure and her cherished friendship with Catherine as congratulations echoed throughout the garden, and servants rushed forward with fresh champagne to toast the future Duke and Duchess of Thornfield. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The marble gazebo stood as a sanctuary amidst the celebration, its white columns and curved roof offering Eleanor a momentary escape from the revelry still unfolding across the Westfield gardens as she pressed her forehead against the cool stone balustrade and fought to regain her composure. Her thoughts, a tempest of emotions she had never permitted herself to acknowledge, until this devastating moment when Alexander had chosen another woman, had chosen her dearest friend. The sound of silk rustling against gravel alerted Eleanor seconds before Catherine appeared at the gazebo entrance, her cheeks flushed with excitement and happiness, blonde curls escaping her carefully arranged coiffure, looking every inch the radiant bride-to-be as she rushed toward Eleanor with outstretched hands. "I have been searching everywhere for you, Ellie," Catherine exclaimed, clasping Eleanor's hands tightly in her own, her blue eyes shining with undisguised joy, as Eleanor summoned every ounce of her considerable self-discipline to arrange her features into an expression of delight rather than the despair threatening to overwhelm her. "I never thought he would choose me, Ellie," Catherine confessed, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper as she glanced over her shoulder to ensure they remained alone in their secluded corner of the garden. "He has always seemed so distant, but perhaps that is just his nature." Eleanor nodded encouragingly, her throat constricted with conflicting emotions as Catherine continued to speak, revealing that she had secretly hoped for this proposal for months. Having fallen in love with the Duke, despite his reputation for coldness and formality, each enthusiastic word was a fresh wound to Eleanor's heart. Yet alongside her, jealousy bloomed genuine concern for Catherine's happiness and a crushing sense of guilt for harboring feelings for the man her friend was to marry. "I am so pleased for you, Catherine," Eleanor finally managed to say, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears as she embraced her friend, while silently acknowledging the terrible truth that had been hiding in plain sight within her own heart for years. She loved Alexander Vane, had perhaps always loved him since their childhood encounters, despite the differences in their stations and his apparent indifference to her existence. As Catherine eagerly shared her dreams for their future life together, Eleanor listened with a fixed smile, nodding at appropriate intervals while mentally cataloguing every interaction she had ever shared with Alexander, searching for any hint that he might have returned her feelings and finding none that could justify the acute pain now radiating through her chest. The afternoon sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows through the gazebo as Eleanor performed the most difficult role of her life, the supportive friend who felt nothing but happiness for the engagement, all while realizing that in losing Alexander to Catherine, she had lost something precious she had never acknowledged possessing in the first place. 3 days after the garden party, Eleanor sat in the modest drawing room of the Blackwood townhouse, attempting to focus on her correspondence while sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the well-maintained but slightly worn furniture that reflected her family's respectable yet limited circumstances in their corner of Mayfair, far from the grandest addresses, yet still within the boundaries of acceptable society. The unexpected announcement of the butler, His Grace the Duke of Thornfield, sent Eleanor's carefully controlled composure into momentary disarray, her quill scratching an unseemly blot across her letter before she could master herself, rising to her feet as Alexander strode into the room with the confident bearing that came naturally to one born to privilege and power. "Good afternoon, Lady Eleanor," he said, his deep voice filling the modest room as he made a formal bow while his dark, perceptive eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite her determination to remain detached. "You seem displeased with my engagement, Lady Eleanor," Alexander continued after they had exchanged the necessary pleasantries and taken seats opposite one another, his fingers tapping a subtle rhythm against the arm of his chair. "I would have thought my choice of bride would delight you, given your friendship with Catherine." There was something in his tone, an undercurrent she could not quite decipher, that suggested more meaning behind his words than their surface implication, causing Eleanor to stiffen defensively as she responded with careful politeness about her happiness for both Catherine and himself while avoiding direct eye contact. As their conversation ostensibly about wedding preparations continued, Eleanor increasingly felt like a specimen under examination, with Alexander watching her reactions to each mention of his engagement with curious attention, almost seeming pleased when she failed to completely mask her discomfort at the discussion of their future life together. "I trust we shall see much of each other once Catherine and I are married," Alexander remarked as he finally rose to take his leave after a conversation that had stretched Eleanor's composure to its limits. "Perhaps you might even consider residing with us for extended periods, as Catherine so values your companionship." The mere thought of witnessing their married life at close quarters sent such visible distress across Eleanor's features that Alexander's expression shifted subtly, a flash of something like satisfaction quickly hidden behind his usual mask of aristocratic reserve. As the front door closed behind him, Eleanor sank back into her chair, hands trembling slightly as she attempted to understand the strange tension of their encounter, a nagging suspicion forming that Alexander had come specifically to observe her reaction to his engagement, though she could not begin to fathom why the Duke of Thornfield would concern himself with the feelings of a woman he had always treated with polite indifference throughout their acquaintance. Rain pattered steadily against the high windows of the British Museum as Eleanor sought refuge among the ancient artifacts, her sketchbook balanced on her lap as she worked to capture the delicate details of a Greek amphora, finding solace in the precise lines and measured proportions that demanded her complete concentration and temporarily freed her from the turmoil of her thoughts concerning Alexander and Catherine. The quiet gallery, nearly empty on such an inclement afternoon, offered a peaceful sanctuary until the sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie, causing her to look up into the familiar face of Lord James Harrington, Alexander's cousin and closest confidant since boyhood, his expression warming with recognition, as he spotted her seated on the bench before the glass display. "Lady Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise to find you here on such a dreary day," he remarked, gesturing to the empty space beside her with a questioning glance that she answered with a polite nod, allowing him to join her as she closed her sketchbook to give him her full attention. Their conversation began with pleasant banalities about the weather and the museum collection before James carefully steered it toward his cousin, mentioning the engagement with studied casualness while watching her face with the same attentive scrutiny Alexander had displayed during his visit to her home. "I confess I was surprised by his choice," James said after a moment, his voice lowered despite the empty gallery, "not because Lady Catherine is not delightful, but because I had always believed his affections lay elsewhere." The pointed look accompanying these words caused Eleanor to flush slightly, her fingers tightening around her closed sketchbook as she attempted to maintain her composure beneath his knowing gaze. "He told me once, you know," James continued when she remained silent, "about 5 years ago after several brandies at my hunting lodge, that he harbored deep feelings for you, had done since you were barely more than children." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow, her breath catching as James recounted how Alexander had overheard her declare at her first ball following her father's death that she could never marry someone so cold and calculating as the Duke of Thornfield, words spoken in hurt after Alexander had seemingly ignored her all evening despite their previous acquaintance. "He has never forgotten it, you know," James said carefully. "My cousin may seem invulnerable, but your words cut deeper than you know." Eleanor sat frozen, her mind racing back to that painful evening, remembering the rawness of her grief for her father and the sting of Alexander's apparent indifference after years of childhood friendship, never imagining he might have been within earshot when she lashed out to her friends, never suspecting that her wounded pride had concealed deeper feelings on both sides. The context of that long ago slight suddenly illuminated Alexander's current behavior with new significance, the careful distance he had maintained for years, his unexpected engagement to her closest friend, his strange interest in her reaction to the news, all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking a disturbing shape in Eleanor's mind as rain continued to stream down the museum windows, matching the turmoil that now threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed defenses. Thornfield Hall blazed with light against the darkness of the countryside, its ancient stonework transformed by hundreds of candles, gleaming from every window, as carriages delivered the cream of London society to the Duke's ancestral home for the formal celebration of his engagement to Lady Catherine. Spencer, the massive oak doors opening to admit guests into a world of splendour that few could rival in all of England, the grand ballroom with its soaring ceiling and magnificent crystal chandeliers stood as a testament to generations of aristocratic wealth, the orchestra positioned on the mezzanine, filling the space with elegant music, while servants in immaculate livery circulated with champagne and delicacies among the assembled nobility in their finest evening attire. Eleanor, positioned near a marble column that offered both support and a degree of concealment, observed with growing unease the curious dynamic unfolding before her. Alexander, resplendent in formal black, with the Thornfield diamonds glinting at his cuffs and cravat, paid only the most perfunctory attention to Catherine throughout the evening, performing his duties as host and fiancé, with technical correctness but little genuine warmth, while his gaze repeatedly sought Eleanor across the crowded room, studying her reactions with unsettling intensity. Catherine, by contrast, seemed increasingly uncertain as the evening progressed, her smile becoming more forced with each introduction as the future Duchess of Thornfield, her usual vivacity dimming beneath the weight of the formal occasion and her fiancé's distraction. When the moment for their obligatory dance finally arrived, Eleanor could not refuse without creating a scene, reluctantly placing her gloved hand in Alexander's as he led her onto the floor, his touch sending unwanted shivers of awareness through her, despite her determination to remain unmoved by his proximity. "Do you think I will make Catherine happy, Eleanor?" he murmured as they moved through the steps of the waltz, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "You know her better than anyone." The question, seemingly innocent yet laden with implication, confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in Eleanor's mind since her conversation with James at the museum. Alexander was playing some unfathomable game, using Catherine as a pawn to achieve some purpose. Eleanor could not yet discern but increasingly feared was directed at herself rather than at genuine affection for his fiancée. As they continued their dance, the tension between them building with each turn about the floor, Eleanor made a silent vow to discover Alexander's true intentions and protect Catherine from what increasingly appeared to be a loveless match, motivated by something other than genuine attachment. Even as she struggled to reconcile this calculating behavior with the young man James had described, whose heart had apparently been wounded by her careless words years ago, the contradiction suggesting depths to Alexander Vane that she had never suspected during their long acquaintance. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated Catherine's bedroom at the Spencer mansion, casting gentle shadows across walls adorned with watercolor paintings and shelves, displaying treasured childhood mementos, from delicate porcelain figurines to pressed flowers preserved between glass, creating an intimate sanctuary that reflected Catherine's gentle personality and privileged upbringing as Eleanor sat beside her friend on the window seat, overlooking the manicured garden below. Catherine had summoned Eleanor with an urgent note that morning, and now, with her golden hair loose around her shoulders and still dressed in her morning gown despite the late afternoon hour, she appeared younger and more vulnerable than Eleanor had seen her in years, her usual composure replaced by evident distress. "I fear I've made a terrible mistake, Ellie," Catherine finally confessed after several false starts, her fingers nervously pleating and unpleating the silk of her dressing gown as she avoided meeting Eleanor's concerned gaze. "Alexander has postponed setting our wedding date twice already, and he rarely speaks of love or even affection when we are together. He seems perpetually distracted, as though his thoughts are elsewhere entirely no matter what we discuss." With each revelation, Eleanor experienced the uncomfortable sensation of her loyalty dividing, torn between protecting her dearest friend from what increasingly appeared to be an ill-advised engagement and confronting Alexander about his inexplicable behavior, all while fighting the shameful realization that part of her felt relief at Catherine's doubts, a selfish response that intensified her guilt. "When he looks at me," Catherine whispered, her voice catching slightly as she finally raised her blue eyes to meet Eleanor's, "it is as though he is looking for someone else. Is it terribly wrong to want to be truly seen by the man you are to marry?" The simple question, asked with such genuine bewilderment, pierced Eleanor's heart, crystallizing the cruelty of whatever game Alexander was playing and strengthening her resolve to end it before Catherine suffered further, even as her mind raced with the implications of James's revelation about Alexander's past feelings and his current strange behavior. Eleanor took Catherine's hands in her own, pushing aside her conflicted emotions to focus solely on her friend's well-being, promising that she would help discover the truth of Alexander's intentions, though she carefully avoided revealing her growing suspicion that she herself might somehow be at the center of his inexplicable actions, a possibility too painful and complicated to share with Catherine in her current fragile state. The Duke's private library at his London residence offered an imposing setting for confrontation, the walls lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes collected by generations of Vanes, their gilt lettering catching the firelight that blazed despite the summer evening, casting dramatic shadows across the Persian carpet and illuminating the tense figures of Eleanor and Alexander as they stood facing each other before the massive oak desk. Eleanor had arrived unannounced, her determination to protect Catherine overriding propriety, and the butler, recognizing her as the future Duchess's dearest friend, had admitted her to the library where Alexander worked alone among his correspondence and estate ledgers, his surprise at her appearance quickly masked behind his usual aristocratic reserve. "You are treating Catherine abominably," Eleanor declared without preamble, once the door closed behind her, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger as she recounted Catherine's distress and confusion, demanding to know his true intentions toward a woman who deserved genuine affection rather than cold indifference. Alexander remained unnaturally still during her accusations, his expression hardening with each word until something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes, his knuckles whitening where he gripped the edge of his desk, the only outward sign of emotion as Eleanor continued her impassioned defense of her friend. Is your concern truly for Catherine? Or does it perhaps stem from more personal feelings, Lady Eleanor? He finally interrupted, his voice dangerously soft as he moved around the desk toward her, causing Eleanor to step backward involuntarily, before forcing herself to stand her ground. Their argument escalated rapidly, Eleanor demanding honesty while Alexander questioned her right to interfere, the tension between them building until suddenly, like a dam breaking, Alexander slammed his fist against a bookshelf, sending several volumes tumbling to the floor as his carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. "Yes, I proposed to her to make you jealous," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion as 5 years of suppressed feelings erupted at once. "To make you feel a fraction of the pain I have endured watching you these past 5 years. So close, yet completely beyond my reach." Eleanor stared at him in shock, her anger giving way to disbelief as Alexander continued his confession, describing how he had loved her since they were young, how her careless words at that long-ago ball had convinced him she could never return his feelings, how watching her move through society season after season, always friendly but never more than that, had slowly tortured him until he had conceived this desperate plan to force some reaction from her, never truly intending to follow through with marriage to Catherine. Each revelation transformed Eleanor's understanding of their shared past, illuminating countless interactions in a new and painful light, as she realized the depth of misunderstanding that had separated them for years, while simultaneously kindling fury at the callous use of Catherine as a pawn in his scheme, regardless of the genuine emotion that had motivated it. The small private garden behind Alexander's London house offered a stark contrast to the intensity of their library confrontation, the night air cool and fragrant with blooming jasmine as moonlight silvered the gravel paths and illuminated the formal hedges and flowering shrubs, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to exist outside the constraints of society and propriety, as Eleanor and Alexander continued their conversation beneath the stars. Neither had consciously decided to move outdoors, yet when Alexander had strode toward the French doors following his shocking confession, Eleanor had followed him instinctively, recognizing that the revelations between them required space and privacy beyond the confining walls of the library, the tension between them shifting from anger to something more vulnerable as they walked side by side in silence for several moments. Alexander spoke first, his voice quieter than before but no less intense, as he explained how her perceived rejection years ago had convinced him she could never return his feelings, how he had interpreted her polite but distant manner in their subsequent interactions as confirmation of her disinterest, how the pain of seeing her regularly in society while believing she found him cold and calculating had gradually hardened into a determination to make her experience the same ache of unrequited love he had endured for 5 long years. As his explanation unfolded, Eleanor gazed up at the night sky, gathering courage for her own confession, the magnitude of their mutual misunderstanding becoming increasingly clear with each painful truth revealed between them. "I have loved you since we were hardly more than children," Eleanor finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to face him directly, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the vulnerability of her confession. "But I convinced myself a duke would never seriously consider someone like me, with my modest dowry and unremarkable connections. That night at the ball I spoke from hurt, not truth, wounded by what I perceived as your deliberate slight after years of childhood friendship, never imagining you might have harbored deeper feelings." Alexander remained perfectly still as she spoke, his expression one of cautious wonder mingled with lingering hurt and concern about the damage his scheme had caused, particularly to the innocent Catherine, who had become entangled in their mutual pride and misunderstanding. When Eleanor finished speaking, they stood facing each other in the moonlight, the years of missed opportunities and needless suffering stretching between them like a physical presence, both experiencing the bittersweet realization that their feelings had been mutual all along, yet tempered by the awareness that Alexander's engagement to Catherine created a seemingly insurmountable obstacle to any possible future between them, regardless of their newly confessed love. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Catherine's family drawing room, lending a gentle glow to the elegant but comfortable space with its tasteful furnishings and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, creating an atmosphere of serene domesticity that contrasted sharply with the gravity of the conversation about to take place as Eleanor and Alexander arrived together, their shared tension palpable, despite their careful maintenance of proper decorum. Catherine received them with uncharacteristic quietness, her usual animation subdued as she directed them to seats opposite her on matching brocade chairs, her composed demeanor suggesting she had already guessed the purpose of their unexpected joint visit, even before Eleanor began their carefully rehearsed explanation. Neither Eleanor nor Alexander had slept the previous night, having spent hours discussing how best to confess their deception and long-suppressed feelings to Catherine, preparing themselves for her justified anger and the social scandal that would inevitably follow the broken engagement, yet determined to proceed honorably despite the personal cost. As their confession unfolded, with Alexander admitting his shameful scheme and Eleanor acknowledging her own part in the misunderstanding, they were both startled by Catherine's calm reception, her expression thoughtful rather than outraged, as she listened without interruption until they had revealed everything, including their newly discovered mutual feelings. "I suspected something of the sort for weeks," Catherine finally said when they finished speaking, her voice steady despite the faint tremble in her hands as she smoothed her skirts. "Surely you both realized I could see the way you looked at each other, even before you recognized it yourselves." With remarkable grace, Catherine revealed that she had already begun corresponding with Lord William Pembroke, the second son of the Marquis of Hartley, who had shown genuine interest in her at several recent social gatherings, while Alexander had been conspicuously inattentive. "I deserve someone who loves me as completely as you two love each other," she continued, a sad smile touching her lips as she regarded them with surprising wisdom and forgiveness. "Even if you have both been too stubborn to admit it until now." Relief mingled with lingering guilt for both Eleanor and Alexander as Catherine detailed her growing feelings for William and her own doubts about the engagement, confessing that while Alexander's behavior had hurt her pride, her heart had remained curiously unaffected, a revelation that suggested she had never been as deeply attached as she had initially believed. 6 months after the tumultuous summer that had transformed all their lives, the gardens of Thornfield Hall presented a very different aspect, the lush greens of spring replaced by the rich golden hues of autumn, with red and amber leaves drifting from ancient oaks and harvest decorations of wheat sheaves and pumpkins adorning the stone pathways while servants prepared for the annual harvest festival that had been a tradition at the estate for generations. Eleanor walked beside Alexander along a secluded path that wound through an apple orchard, their conversation flowing with the comfortable intimacy that had developed between them during the careful courtship that had followed Catherine's gracious release from their engagement, a period marked by proper distance and formal visits that had gradually given way to deeper understanding and genuine connection unmarred by the misunderstandings of their past. In the distance, they could see Catherine strolling arm in arm with Lord William Pembroke, their own engagement having been announced the previous week to general approval from society, her laughter carrying faintly on the crisp autumn air as William bent his head attentively to catch her words, the genuine affection between them evident even from afar. Alexander slowed his steps as they reached a small stone bench positioned beneath a particularly magnificent oak, its spreading branches creating a canopy of golden leaves above them, the spot clearly chosen with deliberate intent as he guided Eleanor to sit while remaining standing before her, his usual confidence momentarily giving way to an endearing nervousness she had rarely witnessed in him. "Lady Eleanor Blackwood," he began, his deep voice unusually tentative as he knelt on one knee before her, despite the fallen leaves that would surely stain his impeccable attire, "I have loved you imperfectly and foolishly for years, allowing pride and hurt to blind me to what might have been possible between us had I simply spoken honestly of my feelings instead of devising schemes born of wounded vanity. Will you teach me to love you better, as my Duchess, my partner, and my dearest friend for all the days to come?" Eleanor gazed down at Alexander, her heart overflowing with joy and gratitude for the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect understanding, both of them wiser and more appreciative of their hard-won happiness after navigating the consequences of their mutual pride and misunderstanding. "Yes, Alexander," she replied simply, placing her hands in his autumn sunlight filtered through the golden leaves above them, illuminating this moment of new beginning that neither had believed possible 6 months earlier when hurt and jealousy had threatened to keep them forever apart.